good morning, friends in China, and good evening for friends in North America. My name is Ray Wang, currently the Chief Information Officer and Dean of Libraries and University Press at the University of New Orleans. And I'm today's moderator. Today, we are very pleased to host this seminar on the trajectory of China's higher education, and extremely happy to have with us Dr. Denis Simon and Dr. Qiang to elaborate on a topic of great interest to so many people. This seminar is graciously sponsored by the following groups or organizations. One, US-China Perception Monitor, which is a Carter Center website dedicated to the discussion of US-China relations, the only Chinese language website on these issues. Two, United States Heartland China Association. This association is a bipartisan organization committed to building stronger ties between a US region of 20 states located in the United States between the Great Lakes to the Gulf and the People's Republic of China. And finally, by the Charming Forum, which is an international platform jointly initiated by students and alumni from top universities in the world, including Tsinghua, Beida, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Yale. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes to introduce our speaker and the panelist. First, our speaker, Dr. Denis Simon. Mr. Simon is newly appointed Executive Director of the Center for Innovation Policy at Duke Law. He is also Senior Advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke and Professor of Business and Technology at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. Fluent in Mandarin Chinese, we're going to have a test after this. Dr. Simon has more than 4 decades of experience studying business, competition, innovation, and technology strategy in China. In 2006, he was awarded the prestigious China National Friendship Award by then Premier Wen Jiabao. Prior to returning to Duke, Dr. Simon served as Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University in China. That is from 2015 to 2020. Dr. Simon's career included spells as Senior Advisor on China and Global Affairs in Office of the President at Arizona State University, Vice Provost for International Affairs at the University of Oregon, and Professor of International Affairs at Penn State. He also has had extensive leadership experience in management consulting, having served as General Manager of Anderson Consulting in Beijing, and now, of course, it's actual Accenture, and the founding president of Monitor Group China. He published extensively on issues relating to China, Sino-US relations, and Pacific Rim. I Googled him and found lots of information on him, including his Fulbright scholarship to do research in South Korea, and the fact that he used to hate Chinese food as a child. In 2015, when Duke Kunshan University opened, Dr. Simon added one sentence to Duke president's remarks, which goes to the effect that DKU is a beacon of light during the turbulence of current US-China relations. That turbulent, in retrospect, is but a very mild drizzle. It is my hope, however, this current seminar can serve as a glimmer of light amidst the dark clouds of a very uncertain future. And now Dr. Zha Qiang. Dr. Zha Qiang is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Education at York University, Canada, where he served as a Director of Graduate Program in Education. He holds a PhD in Higher Education from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, which is part of University of Toronto. His interest of research include Chinese and Asia and East Asia higher education, international academic relations, global brain circulation, internationalization of higher education, globalization and education, differentiation and diversity in higher education, theories of organizational change, and liberal arts education in China and elsewhere. He has written and published extensively on these topics in peer-reviewed and highly regarded journals, and has written books and book chapters on similar topics. If you like, you can Google both of them, both Dr. Simon and Dr. Zha, or Baidu them, and for more information, as have I. Some housekeeping items. We have booked 1 hour and a half for the seminar. Dr. Simon will take about 40 to 45 minutes, and Dr. Zha will talk about 10 to 15 minutes, and the rest will be devoted to Q&A. Please submit your questions through Q&A or chat, which is down below. And I will organize them in terms of categories and ask them on your behalf. Now, without any further ado, Dr. Simon, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ray, and thanks to the Carter Center for putting this together, and thanks for all the people who are in the audience, whether they're on this side or the other side of the Pacific. I welcome you, and also welcome an opportunity to respond to your questions. Just like the discussions about the overall rise of China that are very, very important, understanding what's going on in China's education sphere is also critically important. I work on two big issues regarding China. One is the issue of innovation, and the other is the issue of talent. And obviously those two are intricately linked together. But tonight I'm going to talk about literally what I witnessed over the last 5 years in terms of the explosion of higher education in China and Chinese efforts to build, in effect, the country into some sort of education powerhouse. And hopefully I can elucidate some of that for you tonight. So let me see if I can get this to click and go forward. Okay, so right now in China, there are close to 3,000 colleges and universities. About 1,250 of them are degree granting, and 1,300, 1,400 are non-degree. By contrast to the United States, for example, had at the beginning of 2020 about 5,300 colleges. So even though China's population is 4 to 5 times that of the United States, it is still doesn't have as many institutions. And of course, there are questions about the number of real quality institutions. There have been now about almost 17 million students enrolled in bachelor's programs, or what are called Benke Xuehui programs, and 11.3 million enrolled in Zhuangke, which are not fully degree programs. They're really for training people in technical fields. And sometimes the numbers always get confused that China has, 30 million undergraduate students all studying to become engineers, etc. This is simply not true. You have to understand the big difference between Benke and Zhuangke programs in China. At the graduate level, there are about 2.3 million students in master's programs and about 400,000 enrolled in PhD programs. And of course, that's a very large number. And the goal in China is to produce more PhDs, particularly at higher quality institutions, so that those people can become future faculty and future researchers and help drive the cutting edge, particularly in science and technology research. Expenditure on higher education in China, which had been really grossly inadequate during the early years of the modernization program, now has really shot up. And it is increasing steadily, but again, not fast enough given the demand and given the fact that the number of young people that want to go into higher education seems almost endless. But as we'll see, that is not true. In fact, we're going to see that China is running into some sort of demographic issues that are starting to hit the fan now, that the aging population is surpassing the growth of the younger population, particularly the 18 to 24-year-old cohort. The number of tertiary students, has surged a lot. When I first started looking at China higher education, only about 3% of high school graduates were able to go to university. That number now has surpassed 50%. And so every year, including this past 2 years, somewhere between 7 to 8 million students graduate annually. You might say, wow, there's no labor shortage in China. But in fact, when you talk to employers, they do talk about a labor shortage, not a shortage of bodies, but a shortage in terms of the skills that they need in order to enter the workforce in their companies and in factories and these kinds of jobs. As I said, the gross enrollment for universities grew to over 50%. It was almost 53% in 2019. I call that the massification of higher education in China. And it does mean that there's a big change going on in terms of the expectations of young people. What will a university education get me, and how it will change my life? These are big questions, and we're finding out that unemployment for recent graduates has becoming a big problem, which helps to explain why Chinese officials are trying to encourage more people to go to graduate school so they don't end up jobless in the workforce immediately after graduation. The good news overall, however, is that literacy in China is as high as 98% in most of the major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. But in places like Tibet and Xinjiang is as low as 60%. And granted, the government is working to improve literacy, but it still has a way to go in some of the less richer areas of the country, and particularly as we move towards Western China. Now, in order to understand the education system, it's important to understand the role that the Ministry of Education plays. And obviously, there is no counterpart in the United States to the Ministry of Education. It not only drives overall education policy that includes universities and drives the recent spate of educational reforms, but it also sets the course of the curriculum. It determines the contents of exams at all levels, and it directly oversees about 75 to 80 key universities. The entire Gaokao system, which is the university entrance system, is in the hands of the Ministry of Education. And of course, we know that's a hotly debated topic these days in terms of potential reform of the Gaokao. If a university is not directly controlled by the ministry, it is likely under the oversight of a provincial government or a municipal government. The days when many ministries controlled their own universities, that has undergone a major change, and most of the universities and colleges are within some form of national or local level control in a education governmental entity. The Department of International Cooperation plays a key role in the ministry. It oversees all of the cross-border exchanges and agreements. And in terms of my own experience, the recent 5 years, it also oversees all the joint venture projects that take place, the 9 or 10 campuses that are in place, as well as some 1,200 different kind of joint venture projects or joint degree programs. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, has an ever-present role in the education system throughout the country, and more recently, though the role has been somewhat diminished in the 90s and at the turn of the century, the party secretary position now has started to be given much more weight in decision making in many universities, particularly under the leadership of Xi Jinping, which is, for some people creating some sorts of tensions between the desire for more academic freedom and the desire for maintaining some kind of ideological control. And you can see here the ministry is a very complicated organization. There are 6 vice ministers or vice minister level people, and then there are literally 24 different departments that have responsibility for controlling the affairs of the education system across everything from K through 12 all the way through universities. I mentioned the Department of International Cooperation, and Liu Jin is the Director General of that, a very important individual because all of the engagements that China has overseas and all of the foreign students that come into the country, as well as I mentioned, the joint venture universities are under this department. And there is a special division of foreign-related supervision for the running of Chinese foreign schools that is managed by this Department of International Cooperation. I can't tell you how many times we had to visit and engage with them because there's a special body of regulations for joint venture universities that were specifically created under the ministry, and the oversight responsibility is inside that division, and we have to often coordinate with them. Now, I mentioned about the numbers of colleges and universities. So since 2009 all the way up to 2019, basically we've seen every year a small but steady increase in the numbers of universities and colleges, including the appearance of private universities, though private universities really are not yet really critical in terms of the really highest caliber institutions in the country. I talked to you about the difference between Benka and Zhuangke, and this just gives you some sense of that. And particularly when you look at 2019, you can see some 11+ million, almost 12 million in the short cycle programs, and the 17 million or so that are in the Benka system. And so when we count things like engineers, and we're worried that somehow every young person born in China is going to become an engineer, and look at some big numbers, we got to begin to differentiate exactly who we're talking about and what that means. This chart looks at the numbers of students in the higher education system across the board, graduates and undergraduates, some 41, almost 42 million students. And you can look at just the growth, as I said, in the net admission coming out of high school now, reaching some 54% in 2020. The numbers of students in higher the education system, again, the Benka students, you can see the huge difference, in terms of graduate students versus undergraduate students. But what I really want to point out to you is all the way at the bottom, that brownish color line. That's the number of Chinese students that get to study abroad. When we think about the phenomenon of these 370,000 students in the United States, it's again, we think that there's simply a flood of Chinese students coming into this country. But if you actually look at the percentage of students at the undergraduate level who have a chance to study abroad, the number is very, very small. It is really a unique opportunity for someone in China who gets to study abroad. And this is even after the proliferation of so-called Zifei students who no longer depend on the government for funding, but actually use their own family funds and personal funds to study abroad. The number still is very, very tiny. And again, something just to recognize about the system. This is a look at the enrollment numbers, again, between 2008 and 2018, growing to almost 8 million students. So from 6,000 to about 8,000 in terms of the new enrollment, 8 million in terms of the new enrollment. You can see really the growth has been steady. More and more young people are wanting to go to university, and that's created this push on the supply side to meet this growing demand. The problem is that when China increased the enrollments and they increased the numbers of universities, they did not have available to them quality faculty to assume positions in these new universities, let alone to deal with the expansion in existing universities. And so there were many young people going to universities and getting a subpar education. And so just because you have a certificate in your hand, clearly, not only does it not guarantee you a good job, but it also may mean that you don't necessarily have the caliber of skills that are needed, particularly in China's more and more demanding workforce these days. And so quality jobs are really hard to come by. Now, this is just again, another example of just showing this massification of Chinese higher education. And that I know that I worked at Arizona State University, where Michael Krogh talks a lot about inclusivity rather than exclusivity. And the reality is that more and more of the high school graduates in China are getting a chance to enter some kind of university program. Whether or not that's good, a good thing to happen, we've seen the Chinese recently start to talk increasingly about the importance of vocational education because the economy is demanding certain skills, and those skills are not available. It's sort of like in the United States, where it's hard to find a plumber or a carpenter or a skilled tradesperson. Chinese society clearly needs these people, but not many parents have the aspiration for their child to become a plumber or a carpenter. So China has to find some balance between university education and vocational education. This is looking at master's degree and PhD growth. Again, you can see the steady growth, particularly starting in 2017 of master's students, a big increase in numbers, and then the steady growth in PhD student enrollment. I think that the growth in master's programs, as I said before, has been a result of a kind of a push and a pull. The fact that students can't readily find good jobs when they graduate undergraduate means that they've been choosing to go on for a master's degree. But that may just mean that they postpone the inevitable, that they're going to finish another degree program and still meet with some difficulties in trying to find a job. And you'll see some of this in terms of the choices of majors that I'll talk about in a minute. Here is the focus of undergraduate academic disciplines, 2010 versus 2019. And you can see, for example, the numbers of students studying literature in 2010 went down compared to 2019. But the numbers of students studying engineering went up. The number of students studying management went up. And slightly the numbers of students in medicine also went up. And you can see that these are the fields where obviously there are growth opportunities in terms of the job market. And so if you want to work for Baidu or Tencent or something, you're going to get a degree in computer science, computer engineering, and in those kind of fields. What's interesting is to see that there was a slight decrease in terms of the numbers of students enrolled in science. And again, I think that all has to do with the job market and job opportunities. At the graduate level, we see similar kinds of things. And again, this should not be a surprise to those of you who know anything about Chinese higher education. For graduate study, we can see some slight increase in terms of those students going into the field of education. Education administration, obviously, is a good area with the growth in the number of universities. But the drop in the number of students in science is not insignificant and something that we need to take a look at, particularly because Chinese officials right now are concerned about the fact that there's not enough basic research going on in China. And if China is going to overcome the gap with the West, it's going to have to generate more basic research, which is why in the 14th five-year plan, the amount of investment in basic research now is going to double over the coming years. The big number, of course, the thing that sticks out is just simply enrollment in engineering. That number keeps climbing, and it's so dominant in terms of the numbers of students that are enrolled. And of course, the other area is management. And hopefully more students will go into management so that they can do a better job at managing some of these engineers. And so the innovative capability can be harnessed to produce some more commercially viable, attractive products and services and get them out into the marketplace. Now, China's efforts to build up its university sector have gone through a number of steps. Again, those of you who are familiar with the higher education system have heard of words like Yao Yao or Jiubaowu, the 211 project and the 985 project. These were big initiatives begun by the ministry in the 1990s, late 1990s, all designed to raise the level of Chinese universities. Yao Yao originally started with 99 universities and grew to 116, and these were selected to receive extra funding, all hoping to advance their growth and their development. That program eventually was ended in 2014. The 985 program started in 1998. Its aim was very specific: to create the equivalent of China's Ivy League universities, the C9. Big money was given to these universities and to grow them into world-class universities by some early part of the 21st century. And we do see, you'll see a chart later on that shows the numbers of Chinese universities that have made it into the top tier of the world's top universities. And we're starting to see, just like in the global Fortune 500, we see more and more Chinese companies. In the top university 100, we also see more Chinese universities. The next thing I want to talk about is the plan Yao Yao Yao, or Plan 111, which was the program designed to 100 new innovation centers. And the goal was to bring more foreign researchers and faculty to help bolster universities, and part of the effort to build these universities into the equivalent of research universities in the United States. The goal was not simply to gather Chinese talent, but to gather global talent and bring them into China. Joint venture universities, I might say, are bringing in some of that talent, but the numbers of faculty that are going into Chinese universities from around the world, that number still is a rather small percentage of the total faculty and research staff that are present. We all know about the 1,000 Talent programs. That has become a dirty word these days. It was started in 2008, all designed to recruit leading experts in research and to bring them back to China, particularly Chinese who had spent 7, 8, now 10 years abroad, to come back and bring with them their know-how and their accumulated knowledge to help catapult China into the ranks of the most technologically advanced nations. And that program, as we know, has gotten into some trouble. There was some variability in how that program was implemented, and it brought both the United States and China into conflict with one another. And I'll talk about that in somewhat more detail in a little while. Did that program succeed? It brought some people back, but clearly the best and the brightest, with a few exceptions like Shuri Gong at Shihu Dashi at Westlake University. But for the most part, the best and the brightest still stayed abroad. The double first-class university program, which is the one that we are living with now, was started in 2017. It was designed to create what was called 42 world-class universities and 95 world-class disciplines, or 95 world-class faculties, where China would be among the top universities in a particular field and could claim a top spot, whether it be in artificial intelligence or some type of engineering, etc. Every one of these programs, every one of them in terms of the investment that's being made, etc., had the one paramount goal: to bring Chinese universities into world-class status that could enhance China's image in the world, and most important, build a talent pipeline that could serve as the key to China's goals in terms of becoming a more innovation-driven nation. And Xi Jinping himself has realized the importance of the education system and the role that it plays. That's why he's so adamant about maintaining global engagement for Chinese universities, and why the ministry, despite some of the concerns about worship of Western things and Western ideals, etc., continues to encourage Chinese students to go abroad, and continues to encourage international students to come to China. So this is a ranking of the top Chinese universities in terms of the Times Higher Education ranking in 2019. You can see, and again, some of these are no surprises, Tsinghua and Beida ranked 23 and 24th. Then came the University of Science and Technology under Zhong Keyuan, and Zheda, Fudan, Nanjing, and Jiaotong, all of which we know are good universities. And I think the one thing that we find in China, as you go through this list and look at the top 10 or 15 or so, is the precipitous drop in quality once you leave that top 15 or so. You can go to the United States and you can go through almost the top 100 universities and get a very good education at most of these institutions. But in China, once you leave those top 15, maybe even we allow for top 20, there is a little bit of a drop. And that drop then becomes much more precipitous when we move out into 50 and 100 and then beyond. So let me talk in a little bit more detail about the double first-class universities program, because I think that this is very, very important, since China has put so much money into it and so much effort into it, and has made a big investment. And I think the big thing about it is that if this program succeeds, it clearly will create a group of very, very elite universities. And as we can see, 8 universities on the list are in Beijing, 6 are in Shanghai, the bulk are on the coast. And that raises a bunch of issues, for the program about, whether or not the rich are going to get richer and the poor simply are going to get poorer. The program is ambitious in terms of starting with 2020. There was a group of identified the world-class universities and disciplines that are going to be targeted. And then 2030, add some more universities. And then 2050, China becomes this global higher education powerhouse that I've been talking about. But as I said, there is this resource allocation issue, and whether or not it is good for a country like China, given the size of the population that wants to go to universities, to create this kind of series of elite institutions and then worry about everybody else. And I think that this is something that we have to think about. Another thing we have to think about when we look at this program is, what does it mean to be world-class? Is that a Western definition in terms of quality? And what about the admonition of Xi Jinping that universities need to be places to support Chinese values and Chinese ideas? And how does that intermix with the idea of becoming a world-class university? And what about fields like traditional Chinese medicine, which clearly have a great opportunity for China, but do they really represent the kind of medical treatment that is going to help qualify for world-class ranking among those who evaluate these universities? Finally, there is the whole issue of digital technology inside these universities, and whether or not they are keeping up with Western universities in terms of the role of these technologies as part of instruments of pedagogy and instruments for managing these universities in one way or another. Next, I want to talk a little bit about research in universities. You know, when Chinese universities for most of the 80s and most of the 90s continued to follow much of the former Soviet model where research occurred in research institutes and didn't occur in universities. But the interface with Western universities and the experience with working with big research universities in the United States in particular gave the Chinese the notion that they too wanted to create a replica of these research universities, and thus starting after the turn of the century, big effort was made to invest. But the interesting thing is that R&D spending at universities for the most part has remained fairly flat for the last 10 years. About 7 to 8% of total R&D spending in China occurs within universities. And so while the number for R&D spending in China has grown rapidly now to about almost 2.4% of GDP, as a percentage, the role of universities has increased in relative terms, in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it hasn't become more significant out of the mix. And I think the new pressure to increase investment in basic research now is going to mean that hopefully the role of universities and their place in this R&D mix is going to expand in the years ahead. But we can see this is something that is a little bit of a concern if you're really trying to build research universities that have a much more prominent role in the R&D system in China. Now, let me talk a little bit about the numbers of students from China going abroad for study. We know that number has been a fairly big number, but there are some issues now that are out there that are raising questions about whether or not not only the demand, but the desire among parents and others for students to go abroad is going to be sustained. There are questions about Chinese demographics, as I mentioned. There are growing income inequalities. And there's a changing international environment, as we've seen, particularly in the United States. And everyone is asking the question, is there going to be a slowdown in this demand? We don't see it in the totality, but we'll see it particularly in terms of the United States. The preferred destinations for studying overseas, this is the chart that compares 2015 and 2019. You can see the United States by 2019 had slowed down somewhat. In this chart of the survey, they're only 43% down from 51%, and a big increase in the UK as a preferred destination. We see a drop in Australia, again, given some of the political tensions between the two countries. We see a drop in Canada, interestingly. Jia Qiang may want to comment on that. We see an increase in Hong Kong, but this data may have occurred before the disturbances took place in Hong Kong, and I wonder if that will hold true. But the more interesting things is that the increase in Japan and Germany as preferred destinations, and also Singapore. And one wonders what's going to happen with those numbers as we look out into 2022, 23, 24. The numbers of Chinese students studying in the United States from 2010 to 2019, we can see sort of not a plateauing yet, but a flattening of the curve, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, where the numbers have seemed to have slowed down from the big increase that took place after the turn of the century, and particularly the numbers of students at the undergraduate level. Recently, Pew Research Center did a survey about U.S.-China relations and talking about the attitude about Chinese students coming to the United States. And one of their biggest findings was that of those surveyed in their questionnaire, 55% of the Americans surveyed said that they prefer limiting the numbers of Chinese students studying in the United States. That's a big change. Given that Chinese students were very, very welcome in the U.S. The only group that really shows a big amount of support and opposition to any limits are people in the age category 18 to 29. And those are the kids, of the age who have studied with Chinese counterparts, who may have made friends and learned a lot about their Chinese colleagues, and maybe even traveled to China or took a course in Chinese culture or something. They seem to be a big supporting element in this. But aside from that, we see generally this lack of support support for continuing the big growth and big involvement. Now, why is this occurring? Well, first of all, I think it is true that the Chinese student experience has not all been uniformly positive for both sides. When we look at these now 370,000 students, there have been problems. People have talked about ghettoization of Chinese students, or the fact that they don't mainstream within US campuses as just one of the problems that they experience in terms of their academic exposure during their 4 years in the United States. There are now new parental concerns that have emerged. Every time there is some violent act on a US campus, Chinese parents become much more concerned about safety issues. There are the issues of the current political relationship, and now more recently, there are issues about racism, all increasing the concerns on the Chinese side, plus the problems with getting visas, and also the fact that the H-1B opportunities and even perhaps OPT opportunities now are also going to be much more limited. The pandemic and the national security concerns have made the US even more tight with respect to the granting of visas. And so we don't know how, as the COVID pandemic comes to a slow ending, how this is all going to turn around and whether it's all going to turn around. And the US public, which had welcomed these students and continues to welcome international students, more generally speaking, how they will react to any kind of resurge in the presence or the desire of Chinese students to come. This is not a small matter. You can see the fields in which Chinese students have been studying in the United States. This is 2018-19 data, about 20% in math and computer science, almost another 20% in business and management, and perhaps 18-19% in engineering. Many students will want to come to the United States to study fields like AI, for example, and the US government, particularly during the Trump administration, and whether there's going to be carryover, indicated that, you know what, perhaps we shouldn't allow Chinese students and scholars to come to the United States to study some of these more sensitive fields, and perhaps there will be some constraints imposed. Again, the Biden administration is now looking at these things and deciding. Today was some good news to those of you who read the press. There is talk of a big bilateral meeting between senior US and Chinese officials in Alaska, in Anchorage, Alaska, in order to break the ice and see if they can find some new common ground to dispel some of these tensions that exist. But right now, we still are living with the legacy of the Trump administration, and the Biden administration doesn't show any indication it's going to make a radical shift back to somewhere. What's all created this mess, you might say, is this issue of industrial espionage, or alleged industrial espionage, and IPR theft. And since 2018 in particular, the issue of Chinese acquisition of know-how through illicit and nefarious means has become a major public policy issue. Look, for the record, let me state my view, which is that probably 98+% of all Chinese students and scholars who come to the United States come with good intentions, have no hidden agendas, and engage in two-way collaboration as it was meant to be and as it was designed by both parties when it was developed. A very small percentage, a few opportunists, engage in illicit, unethical, and perhaps even illegal actions that violate the academic protocols. They're incentivized usually for a big payday back in China. They act on the hope that they can gain some jewel of knowledge, and they can turn that into some commercial win when they go back to China. But the bulk of these people are not really engaged in direct or explicit theft of technology. The 1,000 Talent Program, again, clearly, as I indicated, has had many problems. Many Chinese American faculty have not wanted to give up their tenure jobs in the West, so they arranged some kind of modified form of being in China and being in the United States. Many didn't inform their deans. Many didn't declare the compensation that they received from the Chinese side. And so this created a lot of problems, and you may realize that some of the cases that are prosecuted in dealing with this TTP program have nothing to do with technological theft, but have to do with violation of employment agreements and confidentiality agreements that required reporting any kind of duality of employment or things of that sort. I also must say Western universities share some of the blame for these problems because the numbers of visiting scholars and students just grew out of control in many ways. It was a good payday, it was good for internationalization, and they did not have enough vigilance and oversight and didn't manage a lot of these visiting scholars as well as they should have, and created opportunities for these opportunists to break ranks and do some of these nefarious things. The problem is that the Trump administration, had wanted to what they call decouple or de-link of the United States. The irony is that this would have occurred at a time when the asymmetry between the US and China in technological terms was largely disappearing and giving way to greater parity. In other words, this is a time when there are actually real benefits to be obtained by the West from cooperation with China. And so the need is not necessarily to close down the programs. The need is to develop a new framework and perhaps even a code of conduct among universities on both sides to provide rules of the road in order to define how competition should proceed. Now, my time is sort of up, but just the last couple of things. The total number of students studying in China, this has also started to become a big deal, reaching in 2019 over 500,000. The students come from over 125 different countries. They're enrolled in over 1,000 different colleges, and over 50% are not short-termers. They're there for getting degrees. Over 52% are getting some kind of degree. South Korea is the largest source. Thailand, Pakistan, India, number 5 is to the United States. And again, as many of you know, one of the biggest problems that we've had in the US is getting more US students to want to study in China, even if it's for short-term programs. Also getting students to want to go to China to learn the language in a serious way. One of the problems with the Confucius Institutes is that they became one of the main vehicles for training Chinese, and that with their demise in many cases, opportunities were lost at the local educational system as well as in universities to have Chinese teachers who could help advance the study of Chinese language. And this is something that is potentially disturbing. Now, some good news for China in all of this is that whereas in the early periods of study abroad, and particularly when the numbers had started to increase, there was a serious brain drain problem. First at the graduate student level, and then including undergraduates who went on to graduate school in the US and then hopefully had gotten their H-1Bs. But now, starting about right after the financial crisis ended and the difficulty with getting H-1B began, we've started to see a reversal of this brain drain problem, and we're starting to see some indication of some brain gain. And that many students now are seeing that, look, they can get some so-so mid-tier job in the United States, perhaps. But in China, that's where technology is hot, new startups are hot, places like Hangzhou are turning into new hotbeds of entrepreneurship, and that they can find new opportunities in these places, and they're starting to look there. I'm not going to have time to talk about joint venture universities, so let me just skip to the end and get to where I think we all want to be. China has just announced the 14th five-year plan, 2021 to 25. It is a remarkably different plan in tone than the 13th five-year plan, because in contrast to the previous plans that talked about quantitative expansion, this plan talks about quality, 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 the goal of which is to help students get jobs when they graduate, not simply just to satisfy employment numbers, but also to make sure that there are amply qualified people available to the companies that want to hire and need well-trained talent. The plan talks about cultivating and making better use of the faculty so that China can produce more world-class leaders in research and technology, and to give more room to young researchers so that they can develop and become competitive at a global level in terms of grants and other kinds of funding that may be available. Universities are going to be incentivized to contribute more and more to local innovation and regional innovation efforts, and the academic industry collaboration that was encouraged through the Bayh-Dole Act here in the United States. China is trying to make that relationship work better within the Chinese context and create what they call an industry innovation chain that can cultivate both innovation and talent at the same time. Of course, this is going to be at a time when China also wants to continue to engage in international cooperation and collaboration, but it's going to be difficult. And I know a lot of US universities who were talking about potential joint ventures in China now have become somewhat more skittish as their boards of directors and trustees have raised questions about whether or not China is the right place at the right time, given some of the political issues and given some of the issues that are going on in Hong Kong and Western China. So in the final analysis, China is going to have to strike a balance. It's going to have three things that it's going to have to juggle. First, how to establish and embed certain Western values and philosophy, particularly the idea of world-class academic quality in universities. And that can only occur through greater openness and more global integration with its university system. That's going to be balanced with a set of Chinese values and philosophy, respect for China's traditions and history, as well as some of the political, philosophical and ideological points that Xi Jinping thinks are so important to imbue in China's young people. And those are necessary because they're good for China's social harmony, according to the Chinese leadership. And then finally, Marxist values and philosophy, and that is to have a well-ordered society and to maintain control of the Communist Party and have a political stability. China needs to also imbue its young people with some of these so-called Marxist values. And how do you balance all of these three things at the same time so you can get this world-class outcome in qualitative terms and yet get the social political outcomes you want at the same time? There may be some fundamental contradictions here. And I think the interesting thing will be for the next several years is to watch how these contradictions get played out, how China ultimately ends up balancing those. Because I can tell you from my experience with the several hundreds of Chinese students that came to DKU, these kids are different. They're not like their parents and they're not like their grandparents. They see the world in a very different way. Their expectations are much more in line with a set of Western values and philosophy. And I think being able to get them to digest and assimilate and socialize with these other two sets of values, not so much the Chinese values, but the Marxist values, I think is going to be presenting an increasing challenge as the years go on. So let me end here and say thank you. And sorry I ran a little bit over, but hopefully you got the gist of what I was trying to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. And Dr. Zha, would like to hear what you would like to add.
Thank you. I want to thank the CARD Center for having me in this event. It's very meaningful and significant. And also I want to thank Denis for this very thorough presentation about what happened to Chinese higher education in the past 20 years. This is the data are so rich and amazing. Before I offer my view, I want to remind the audience that even though Denis didn't have time and chance to talk about that Duke Kunshan University, the joint ventures, I want to remind you, Denis is among the very rare species who run the offshore campus on Chinese soil. I'm pretty sure there are now no more than 12 such standalone joint ventures, even though there are like 2,000 to 3,000 joint programs, but in terms of the standalone joint ventures, no more than 12. So, yeah, he is the person who can offer the very interesting insights about running, operating a joint venture on a day-to-day basis. I want to echo Denis's presentation by highlighting the two angles to look at the higher education growth and development in China. By all means, the higher education growth is phenomenal. Do you want me to increase my volume? Professor Wang?
I hear you fine. I hear you fine.
Oh, okay. Okay. Based on Denis' presentation, I want to say that there could be two angles to look at the higher education growth in China. One is benchmarking the growth with China itself. That's pretty much the presentation of Denis. And you can see this is enormously, extraordinarily successful story. I won't repeat those data because Denis' presentation has a lot of data, but I want to give you a snapshot so you can, well, hopefully that will enhance your impression. Because Denis presenting the data until up to 2018. Let me just give you a snapshot about what happened in 2019. In 2019, the single year, the Chinese students, the Chinese universities graduated. Hang on, let me just find out the data. Yeah, in 2019, the Chinese universities conferred 7.6 million bachelor's degrees, 577,000 master's degrees, and 62,000 doctorate degrees. So that's in a single year. And the expansion spanned the last 20 years. And in those 20 years, every year, the higher education enrollment increased by 1.4 million in China. So I don't know how you absorb those numbers. For me, it's stunning. So I want to give you those numbers just in addition to enhance your impression of the higher education expansion in China. The expansion happened not only on the horizontal dimension, I mean the enrollment increase, but also on the vertical dimension. Denis mentioned those world-class university initiatives, Projects 211, 985, and now the double first-class universities. And it's again a quite successful story. And now you can see routinely, regularly, some 50 Chinese universities can make their way into the global ranking league tables. I mean, these major global ranking league tables. And Denis mentioned that the Times Higher Education Supplement global ranking, and others include the QS, the US News and World Report, and also the Shanghai Jiaotong. So now, on a regular basis, some 50 Chinese students, universities can make their way into the league tables, and about 10 to a dozen can be ranked into the top 200. Again, the very latest data, the QS just announced the rankings of the subjects. And this year, China has a record high, 126 the programs offered by the Chinese universities now among the world top 50 in their own subject area. So this is, again, another thing to show the successful story. Those things cannot be imagined some 20 years ago. So this is one angle to look at the higher education expansion by benchmarking with China itself. The second angle is to benchmark with the US. I guess this is another reason that we have this webinar. And also there's legitimacy by comparing China with the US, because literally the China modeled on the US experience and the patterns in the effort to raise the higher education standards in the country. So if we benchmark the China's higher education expansion development with the US, I want to point out two things. One is, again, it's a quite successful story, but this time with the controversies. On the successful side, one thing I want to highlight here is China being taken advantage in terms of the STEM human capital. Dennis just mentioned and already also presented the data. Here I want to share you the data the World Economic Forum reported. In 2017, the report said China had 4.7 million STEM graduates, as opposed to 568,000 the same year in the US. So the ratio, China-US ratio is 8-1. And the report estimated the ratio would go up to 15-1 in 2030. So again, so the gap is widening. So this is a very successful aspect of the Chinese higher education. But I want to share you a controversy now. A very recent study, this is a comparative study among the STEM students in China, US, Russia, and India. So this paper just published in a Nature journal called Nature Human Behavior. So this study compared the learning outcomes of the students in those 4 countries. So I would skip those Indian students and Russian students, just pick up the comparisons between the Chinese students and the American students. So the research shows the Chinese university students experience, let me just read some details, experience significant declines in critical thinking skills, while their US peers show significant increase in their critical thinking skills during the tenure of university education. Such a change happened at the circumstances that the Chinese and US students scored very close in critical thinking at the start of their university programs. And the study further shows that Chinese students studying in both elite and non-elite. So this is an interesting point. So the study includes the students in both elite and non-elite institutions. They all experience decrease in their critical thinking skills, only to different standards, different extents. 17% for those in elite universities and 68% in the non-elite universities. So here's my point is the critical thinking is key to the robust innovations. So there's a lack of the critical thinking skills among the Chinese university students would raise questions and concerns for the country.
We lost you, Qiang. Yeah, for some reason we lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but not Professor Zha. In view of the time, so I will start some questions from here. I mean, we can't hear Professor Zha anyway. He is welcome to jump in whenever he can. So one of the questions I received from a Q&A panel is about the, I mean, this is to Dr. Simon, of course. Basically says that because of COVID and also because of the bad relationship, Chinese students are now going to other places. So what, in your view, the US universities should do and can do to attract these students back?
Okay. So I think that NAFSA, IIE, ACE, AIEA, all these organizations that are concerned with international education are all serving as sounding boards and also providing platforms in order to send information into the State Department and into the Department of Education and into the White House, talking about renewing the visa process and getting these students to come back. But I think there's more to that. I mean, even if the visas were to be reopened again, I think that a lot has to be done to win back some of these students so that their parents, most important, will know that it is safe and okay for them to come to the United States, that they are welcome. Before I left China in May of 2020, the Ministry of Education asked me to join a group of very distinguished Chinese former officials, people who are well recognized across China, to make a video that was shown to well over 400,000 people, that the United States still welcomes Chinese students. It was a little bit of a propaganda video, but I saw the value in it in terms of helping Chinese families understand that the U.S. was still a safe, welcoming place for Chinese students, and that the experience of a bad experience of a few students did not mean that the whole thing had just gone to hell in a handbasket. That video was impactful, but now that video is already going to be a year old. And the situation, to be very honest, has gotten worse. I think people are going to have to go on these visiting delegations and go visit and do dog and pony shows and show that their campuses are going to a great effort to make Chinese students feel welcome. I just think that we need that at the top to happen, but also I think we need to happen at the working level so that the parents, who play a very big role in the college decision of Chinese students, much more of a role than the U.S. parents play, that parents can be convinced that coming to the United States is still a good bet for their families and for their kids.
Thank you. There's another question about African students coming from African countries who are supported by the Chinese government's money. Do you have any idea how many of those students are?
So let me talk about two aspects of this. One aspect is, of course, through some of the Belt and Road Initiative, and also through simply China's resource diplomacy of its engagement with African countries. Both Chinese state-owned companies as well as the Chinese government itself has directly sent and paid for a certain number of students to come to China for university education. And the person who asked the question is correct. The bulk of those students have been given scholarships by the Chinese government. I don't have a number, and the reason why I don't have a good number is the second point I want to make. One of the problems with these efforts to bring Chinese students to China is that a number of them agree to come who actually don't have the funding, even though the funding compared to what a regular tuition would be in the States is so small. It's about, Tsinghua University is 8,000 renminbi a year, so it doesn't compare to 40 or 50,000, for a university in the United States. These students, a number of people come to China claiming to be students, and then they disappear into the woodwork. They go and they're engaged in business activities and other things. And this past year, we had a bad problem. Jiangsu University had invited 100 African students to come for a show and tell day. And when the first day of the program opened, there were only some 10 to 15 students that actually showed up for the program. The rest used their visas simply to come into China and plug into some kind of African network that's engaged in both, to be very honest, both legal and illegal activities in China, particularly in and around southern China. And they have become a big source of problems for Chinese officials, particularly with respect to smuggling, drug trade, and other kinds of nefarious activities. And so this has put a a damper on some of this. I know that we have had a number of African students who have come to us, and we had a recruitment day where we paid for our international students to come to DKU who had been accepted. The Chinese embassy would not give them visas if they were coming to Africa. They would only give them visas for F1, the equivalent of in the US F1, to come study in China directly, not to come for one of these visits, what we call our cell day, to get the students, to agree to matriculate. So that presented a lot of problems for us and a lot of the other joint venture universities. So there's got to be a lot of effort worked out between these nations and the Chinese government to understand what's going to happen when they recruit these young people to come, under what auspices they're going to arrive in China, and who's going to make sure they actually are coming to attend classes. But government scholarship is a big deal in China. There's something called the Jasmine scholarship that will pay for your 4 years in China. And then there are graduate scholarships and even scholarships for students to go to medical school. And I know that these are considered to be very much jewels, when they're given out in China, and very prestigious. But the degree to which China is the end goal, for these students, I'm not clear. It's not really clear.
So, Professor Zha, do you have? Now can you speak now?
Yeah, I think I'm back. I apologize for that. Obviously, there's a technical issue with my earphone, so now I got a new set. So I want to be brief and to finish those the data. I saw in the chat people show interest in those data. So let me just repeat briefly. The research shows the Chinese university students in both elite and non-elite institutions, they all experienced a decrease in the critical thinking skills in the first 2 years study. The elite university students experienced decrease by 17%, as opposed to students in a non-elite experience decrease of 6 to 80%. We all agree the critical thinking ability is key to the innovations, robust innovations. So such a lack of the critical thinking capacity and ability would raise concerns about the sustainability of innovations in China. The same study shows even more interesting thing, that because the sample was the STEM students, and particularly the computer science and electrical engineering students. The same study shows the students in the elite institutions in China do not experience any skills gain in mathematics, and the physics skills in the first 2 years. And the students in the non-elite institutions experience a significant decline in the mathematics skills and no gains in the physics skills, again, in the first 2 years study. So this is interesting and triggered a lot of heated discussions and debate in China and outside China. So I want to highlight the study. This is very new, just came out in the Nature Human Behavior journal. Again, I want to go back to the successful side. China is now a leading producing country in terms of science and technology papers. It depends on what database you reference to. China is either number 1 or number 2. When China is number 2, the US is number 1 producer of the science and technology papers. My own research, I retrieved the data from the Google academic. So I retrieved data of almost 4.3 million papers authored by the Chinese researchers and American research. So I found in 6 fields, the Chinese papers already outnumbered the publications by the US counterparts. Those 6 fields are material science, chemistry, mathematics, engineering, computer science, and physics. And recently, in a trade war, the US took advantage of China's technological bottlenecks. Using the literature language, it says, US hold China by throat because of those technical checkpoints. China was very dependent on the foreign technologies in those technical checkpoints. Interestingly, I found, if you look at the Science and Technology Daily, that's the newspaper. I think they published some 20 reports. Anyhow, those reports cited 35 key technologies. But if you look at that list, it's interesting to see those 35 key technologies mostly relate to the 6 fields I just presented. So the thing is, in those 6 fields, China already overtake the US in terms of the publication volume. Those are journals, all decent journals, including many top journals. But those 35 technologies still stand up as the technological bottlenecks for China. So how can we understand that? So those things I want to share all together as when we benchmark the higher education development in China with the US. And so we can see now still quite successful stories, but again, with some the controversies. So at the end, I want to offer my ultimate view. That is, those research success stories now people say ushered in some kind of Sputnik effect upon the American universities. My view is if the Chinese universities could really pose a threat to the US counterparts, it is the moment when the Chinamen contribute to the world higher education community an alternative model of the university. And now the US model of the university remains an example and provide the foundation for the development of universities around the world. Clearly, we can see the American research universities now occupy 2/3 of the top 20 slots on any global university ranking legal table. So I want to stop here, and if I may, based on those comments, I'd like to ask Denis a few questions. My first question is, what is your perception of the quality of Chinese university education based on what I shared, those comments, research, and controversies? And to what extent the internationalization may help improve the quality? So this is my first question. My second question is, what is your take of the research standards at the Chinese universities? And to what extent the current fuzzy or tricky situation regarding university interactions between China and the US could affect the research progress at the Chinese universities? And my third question is, do China-US university interactions follow a zero-sum or the positive-sum logic, given the degree of the student mobility and the research collaborations? My last question is, now the U.S. Is planning to sanction restrictions on Chinese universities for participating in the research projects concerning national security. I think Dennis mentioned that already, and I believe the UK, EU is following the suit. So what would be the expected outcome of such an exercise? And is there any unexpected consequence of such exercise? Thank you.
Ray, how would you like us to proceed?
Yeah, why don't you sort of summarize and give a general type of answer?
Okay.
Because I have a few, including one of your students' question from Kunshan. So
let me quickly respond. First, in terms of the quality, I think that there are again, as I indicated, below the top 10 or 15 universities, I think the quality does drop off precipitously. I think that we at the DKU, we have not hired many PRC faculty to join DKU. Many have not applied. There has a lot to do with the employment system and retirement, etc. But also just in terms of pedagogical styles and teaching practice and all those kinds of things, we found that it was very hard for them to jump into a US-style classroom environment and be successful. That the road was going to be a very, very long road and not an easy one. And these were people who likely got PhDs in China rather than having gone abroad. I think the role of internationalization is really critical. I think the more faculty that have been trained abroad that come back to China and teach within the ranks of Chinese universities and or become top administrators, they will bring with them the know-how and the understanding of what makes these Western universities strong and vibrant places of new knowledge creation. And I think that one of the best things that can happen is for Chinese universities to maintain their openness to having international students, international faculty, short and long term, and bringing people back. The 1,000 Talent Program even to that effect, if it hadn't gotten caught up in all of this politics, still had some potential to bring with it the learning and knowledge that these people had accumulated going abroad. And I have to believe, for example, in the case of a place like Westlake University, that the impact of having people like Sri Gong and Xu Tian from Yale and some other people is going to make a big difference in how the trajectory of that university in the coming years. In terms of research standards, look, we know that much of the evaluation had been quantitative based. How many articles, how many publications, which journals? It was a very technical formula, and if you met these criteria, you got so many points, etc., etc. I think that the statements coming out in this review last year of higher education and the comments made during the 14th five-year plan discussions all indicate that, as I indicated, quality is the new thing now. And I think that one of the most important factors is the encouragement going to be given to young researchers who are going to be measured against world-class standards of excellence rather than just the old-style Chinese quantitative system. So I'm hoping if U.S.-China relations is to get sour even further, I think that will have a negative impact, because I think that there'll be some trepidation on the part of all researchers involved on both sides that they're stepping into troubled waters, and it might become an impediment for them to go forward in terms of collaboration. I think some research by Carolyn Wagner at Ohio State has showed that there's already been some impact with respect to the COVID-19 research that had been going on, and it seemed to have acquired some momentum, and then all of a sudden has hit a cold spot. So I think that that's the case. Zero sum or positive sum, I have to say, you can't paint the whole landscape with one brush here. The different universities have different needs and different requirements. And I can say there clearly are some universities in the United States that look at Chinese students as just a source of revenue. They need money, they need students, and China provides a readily available source of financial support. And so that's the name of their game. If there were Brazilian students willing to do this, they would have gone to Brazil. And if there were Russian students, they would have gone to Russia. I think that China just happens to be a readily available source of students and students who can pay the tuition amount. On the other hand, I think there are lots of universities, particularly the better US universities, who are not in that position and really are in a win-win positive sum game. They want collaboration. They look at a multifaceted relationship. I know when I served at the ASU, we built 21 different collaborative research projects across China in everything from the humanities to biodesign. And our goal there was to create win-win conditions for both sides. And I know that ASU, because of Michael Crow's leadership, they continue to operate within that kind of logic. Finally, what's the last question about?
The restrictions.
Oh, the defense, yeah.
Yeah.
So, first of all, we can't have visa fraud in the United States. So we can't accept people who work for Guofang Keji Daxue saying that they don't work for Guofang Keji Daxue and saying they work for some kind of a different, entity and coming to the United States under fraudulent terms. We need people who come to the United States to be open and honest. I can tell you, to be very blunt, again, from my ASU experience, for over 6 or 7 years, regularly there were 3 or 4 scholars coming every year from the National Defense Science and Technology University, coming to the engineering school as visiting scholars. The FBI knew that they were there. The university knew that they were there. There was no problem. They declared what they were there for. They were studying quality control and manufacturing. That's what they were all there for. And they came and they went, and it was very positive. We took a couple delegations to visit that campus. Of course, we could send students there exactly in the same way. There were certain obstacles and impediments. But the whole point was that if everyone is transparent and everyone is open and above board, and these people are coming for a reason that is clear and purposeful, that's why I think this code of conduct is so important, because it will establish the rules of the road and it'll determine who can and cannot come and what the expectations are from them when they are in the United States or our people are in China. And I think that that's the only way we can make this thing work, is through greater transparency. And I think the one big point that you made that I tried to make also about the shift from asymmetry to greater parity, that China's progress in science and technology means it's no longer an innovation laggard. And therefore, the nature of the dynamics between the two countries has got to change. And that means the relationship that defines the universities, the 40-year-old framework that we've used to guide us from the late 70s till today, we need a new framework. The old framework is antiquated and obsolete, and we need new rules of the road to guide us into the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, we also have some other questions. One of which is from your, allegedly from one of your students, and he or she says, as a Duke graduate in China, running an international education company, I wonder if Duke may have further plans to expand in China, like opening more campuses or some form of joint ventures in other provinces. There is a great demand for international education cooperation, especially for elite schools like Duke.
The answer is no. Most people don't understand, but the DKU project is a 4-phase project, of which we are only still in phase 2. Phase 2 lasts till 2028. There's still a phase 3 and a phase 4. The Kunshan government has committed, to build the phase 2 out to the tune of some $300 million. And it has similar commitments for phase 3 and phase 4. If there are, functions and academic programs and things that would like to be continued. The reality is that high-end joint venture universities are not a commercially viable proposition unless the Chinese side is willing to pick up the deficit. These universities, in contrast to what many people believe, are not moneymakers. They are the source of great deficit. NYU Shanghai and DKU both suffer from the same problem. The cost of putting on a world-class program in China, hiring the faculty that will enable us to grant a Duke degree in our case and an NYU degree in their case, requires salaries and support and financial arrangements that make this a very expensive proposition. It's not like you can hire cheap faculty in China or build cheap infrastructure. Students who come to our program, particularly the international students, expect to come to a world-class campus with a world-class infrastructure. Duke is not ready to embark on another campus endeavor. That said, I know that there are a variety of entities on the Duke campus that want to engage in new programs in China. Our Center for Aging, for example, in the healthcare area, sees a lot of opportunity in China, perhaps built around the aging of the Chinese population and what's going to be done about that in the years ahead. Global health is another area where we have some very successful research center built at DKU, but that in itself could evolve into more than the master's degree that is being given there right now. The next stage of DKU at some point may involve a PhD program, and whether or not that will happen, I don't know. The law school, the engineering school are yet to be actively involved at DKU. There is one program in computer science and engineering that was launched at the master's level, but that could perhaps be matched with some other programs, perhaps in industrial design or engineering design or some other things. I can tell you for sure that the Ministry of Education, while it will tread slowly on this, has found that its experience with these 9 or 10 joint venture campuses has in general been a very positive one. And particularly because of the cooperation that was attained during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese government had a real good feel-good moment from the way that these JV universities were responsive to protecting the students, the faculty, and the community on their campuses. And I can say that neither NYU Shanghai or DKU, from my understanding, experienced even one case of anyone who had gotten sick with COVID-19. So I think the Chinese government is ready to work with other universities. And I know, because I get phone calls, several universities in the United States, who I can't name, but have already been contacted directly by Chinese counterparts offering, okay, let's now begin discussions about how we can set up a new campus and a real joint venture, just like what DKU and NYU have.
Another question concerns with the overseas students going to China. And it looks like most of them, especially those coming from United States and Western countries, are there to study the language. Very few, if any, are there to study for a degree. So are you aware of any students, if any, who are there to pursue a degree, especially in social sciences and humanities?
Okay, so there's a phenomena that is starting to build up, okay, and I can tell you a little bit about it. As young people get more interested in areas like global climate change and the environment, global health, clean energy and the global energy situation, they are finding that in order to really be knowledgeable in those areas, they must know something about the Chinese case. They must have some knowledge of how China fits into that bigger picture. And that seems to be a vehicle that is now attracting students to come to China and study particularly in some of these one-year master's degree programs. I know Tsinghua's School of Public Policy, for example, with money that had been given to them by the MacArthur Foundation, used that money to build up a very successful public policy program dealing with, in many cases, global issues, and brought in international students that came for a degree. And I think that we're starting to see that phenomenon of that type of student become more interested in coming to China. Surely the students coming from Africa, South Asia, some other places are going into study engineering and technical fields in China. But I think the Western students that are coming are indeed looking to take advantage of the access they would get if they come to China to learn more about these fields and what's going on inside of China. I expect to see not a deluge of students, but I expect to see an increase in the numbers of students who are willing to come to China for degrees if they can study in these areas and gain a deeper understanding of China's role in the global situation regarding energy, health, climate change, et cetera, et cetera.
And also another question concerns with the phenomena that some Chinese faculty members, especially in science and technology, were rounded up by the authorities, and with Qiang Zha of MIT as one of the more recent. And the reactions to those kind of arrests were quite varied. For instance, MIT took a very firm stand in support of this faculty, but not many, quite a few other institutions, especially some public universities, they were dropped as soon as they were dropped from, they were dismissed from faculty of certain universities as soon as they were arrested. So are you aware of any efforts made in academic institutions, especially among academic leaders, to exert some influence on this kind of arrests or attacks or the kind of effort to I like to use a word like witch hunt, so to speak.
Sure. Well, again, I share the outrage, to be honest, about what has happened and the racial overtones that come with it. And I have lots of friends who are ethnic Chinese at U.S. universities who are working, who are as loyal of an American as I am, and to castigate them and to taint them somehow because they're from China or thought to be engaged in nefarious activities, that is just downright wrong. And we have to take as many active measures as we can to fight that. So you may know that the AAU, the top 100 universities in the United States, that organization regularly has met over the last year and a half with members of the US government, including FBI, the intelligence community, et cetera, in order to discuss the quote unquote threats to the security and integrity of the US research enterprise. That has been a #1 issue on their agenda, and it involves discussions about export controls, about compliance, and a number of other things, including the employment agreements that faculty do have with their universities, and what they should what they're required, let me say, to tell their deans. I can tell you, because I've worked on Chinese talent issues for the last 20 years, this was a problem that was waiting to just become a perfect storm. There had been too much hanky-panky going on with respect to the TTP program, the abuse of it on both sides of the ocean. And in many cases, the people who are being rounded up, as I indicated most strongly before, they are not engaged in stealing technology or divulging, secrets to the Chinese government or anything of that sort. What they are in violation of is the agreement that they can't hold 2 full-time appointments at 2 universities and get paid 2 full-time salaries and run a group of graduate students in China like they run a group of graduate students in the United States. That just simply is not tenable, and nor is it legal, and nor is it in conformity with their employment contracts. I can't do it. You can't do it. In fact, nobody can do it. The rules are very, very clear. And for too long, there has been a kind of view, don't ask, don't tell. The deans sort of knew that these faculty were disappearing for 3 weeks at a time. And so instead of being in China for 9 months, they made 9 trips to China, or stayed for 9 weeks in China altogether, or found some sort of trick formula to make TTP work for them so that the university could claim, Professor XYZ is a member of our faculty or a member of our research group or whatever it would be. And I noticed there was a question by somebody on the chat that said Chinese universities are very interested in the prestige and image building, but don't necessarily have the content to support what their claims are. I think that is right. The reputation is very important, and they are name building. The fight. I know a couple of people that were the object of competition between Renda and Tsinghua for one faculty member coming from the U.S. Where would he go? What would he do? Which TPP program is he going to fall under? These things got to be crazy. And so, the wrong stuff on the Chinese side is just as bad as what's also going on this side. But I think that we have to make it known. And I've spoken to a lot of people. I know just this past week, the president of Duke made a strong statement about racial harassment of Asian Americans. And this was in addition to a statement that he made when former President Trump was calling COVID, the Chinese flu or the Chinese virus or whatever whatever nasty words, he was using. We have to, be adamant that we cannot point fingers at people just because the color of their skin or what they look like. And this is something that we have to make it known. My hope is that we actually can work on this code of conduct idea, and we can actually try to reframe the way the universities between the 2 countries engage so that we can moderate the tensions and the tempers that are now all around and ease some of the suspicions because there's too much hyperbole and not enough fact-driven activity. A lot of fingers have been pointed, a lot of accusations have been made, and when the cases are taken to the court, many of them are just knocked out of the court, or the so-called crime that was committed is nothing approximating what was alleged in terms of stealing the crown jewels. So I think we got to be very careful here, very, very careful.
Okay, last question. If DKU and NYU Shanghai are financial failures, do you think they would be closed eventually? How can you make them, if not, how can you make them financially sustainable?
Well, first of all, it is a misnomer to say they are financial failures. I don't know if you realize it, but most academic institutions, they are nonprofit. They don't make money. The reason why universities build up endowments is so they can generate revenue out of their investments to pay for the deficits that they run, because the cost of giving an education is much greater than the monies that they get paid in the total tuition dollars that they receive. And most universities have big, long books, that can explain exactly why education really costs $90,000, but their tuition is only $50,000, and how that $40,000 deficit is made up. DKU operates the same way, and so does NYU, except we do not have the kind of endowment that Duke or NYU have back in the United States. So we don't have the revenue generated to make up those deficits. Therefore, from the start, it was clear that there was going to be deficit. And the only question was what percentage of that deficit would be shared by each of the respective parties. I can tell you that I can't, get into the details of it, but I can tell you that that arrangement has been made between Kunshan and Duke. It is part of this phase 2 agreement that will last for 10 years that began in 2018 to 2028. And that when they come to the phase 3, they will renegotiate a new arrangement about that deficit. The big question for DKU is the project that's going to provide the underpinning for phase 3, if it's simply an expansion of a phase 2 model, they will still continue to run this deficit model. And so the question is, what can they possibly do in phase 3 that would have somewhat of a different financial basis to it? Right now, the ingredients are pretty much the same. World-class faculty, world-class infrastructure, state-of-the-art pedagogy, you get a Duke degree. So if you remove that, then you remove the ability of that degree to get accredited. And it's the accreditation of that degree that gives the bona fides to have and justify the existence of Duke Kunshan University. Unfortunately, if we just gave a Duke Kunshan University degree without the Duke degree, I'm not sure how popular the program would be. It's the fact that we give that Duke degree and NYU gives that NYU degree and Nottingham does the same and Liverpool does the same. It's the fact that they do this that makes sure that the quality is equivalent to the quality back on the home campuses and therefore provide the justification for what the tuition is that we charge. And I just should let you know, by the way, the tuition charged at DKU is the same tuition for international students as it is for Duke students back in Durham. And the tuition charged to Chinese students is about half that charge to Duke students and DKU international students. So from the start, 60% of the students already are paying 50% less than what the business model should justify under normal circumstances. Even 25,000 is still a lot of money for many of those families. It's a difficult challenge compared to what they would pay to go to a Chinese university. I just don't want to leave anyone with the notion, like some congressmen have had when they came out to visit DKU, that somehow the United States universities are selling their souls and their values to make a big payday in China. That simply is not the case. That simply is not what's happening in the case of NYU and DKU. And it would be wrong just to let that sit on the table. We've gone there for a number of reasons, and Duke is there for, let me just say 3 quick reasons. One, because it's part of the internationalization of Duke itself to have a footprint in the world's second largest economy, soon to be the world's first largest economy. Second is for pedagogical innovation. As a greenfields operation, there are things that we could do at the DKU campus in terms of new curricular initiatives, new structures of classes, new interdisciplinary teaching, etc. That would be very hard to enact on Duke because of the legacy systems and the existing, stakeholders in various ways that make it difficult to bring about radical change, in a sustained kind of fashion. And third, the talent pool in China. The numbers of young people that are able to come to Duke from China simply are very small compared to the pool of talent that exists in China. And why wouldn't Duke want to be able to have access to high caliber Chinese young people who could eventually go on to graduate school at Duke or other US universities and become a good pipeline for the next generation of the world's leading thinkers, scientists, policymakers, or whatever. And to do that in a mixed environment where Chinese, American, and young people from other countries get to work together, think together, and solve problems together in a mutually beneficial kind of way. Hopefully, this would build a foundation so that in the years ahead, when they are in their careers and they encounter one another, they can work together in a more amicable, positive some manner. That's the hope and the dream. That's why it's that beacon of light in the midst of the turbulence, because the hope is that it will actually do that. It will provide those three possibilities. So far, during my 5 years there, I know that we began on that road and we've achieved a great deal. My successor, Al Bloom, my predecessor, Mary Bullock, all have helped contribute to this. And that this is not a done deal yet. It's a work in progress, and it's going to continue to evolve over time. Al may take it in a different direction than I did. My job was to get it started and get it rolling, and leave Al with something that he could grab onto and then run, as fast as he can to keep up with what's happening there. And hopefully, and I benefited from the foundation that Mary had provided. So I think that DKU is in good shape. And just so you know, applications this year on both the Chinese side and the international side basically doubled in each category. So we must have done something right.
On that note, we almost have to conclude our seminar. We have already exceeded by 15 minutes. When I was teaching back in the days, maybe late Stone Age, I never ever, delay the conclusion of the class, not even by a minute, because if we did it at the time, students will go hungry. They would have to get lunch. So my apologies for today, but I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of the presentation from you, Dr. Simon and Dr. Zha. And again, my thanks also goes to the Carter Center, Charming Forum, and United States Heartland Association. Again, thank you. Good night for friends in the North America, and continue to enjoy the rest of your morning or the day for friends in China. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good morning, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye. Goodbye.